So, good evening, class, and today we are at lesson 8, and lessons 8 and 9 will be concentrated on the topic of contracts. So, na-discuss na natin yung obligations in general for the past 7 lessons. And as you know, gaya nga nung nasabi natin during the second lesson, that one of the sources of obligation is contracts. So here in contracts, uh, we will be discussing a very specific type of obligation, and perhaps the most common of all the sources of obligation. So, what are contracts? What are the basic principles guiding the idea or guiding the right to enter into contracts, etc. Yun yung magiging topic natin for tonight. Okay, so I will discuss this as if it's continuous, pero hati-hatiin na lang natin sa later. Okay, there are 5 basic principles na nag-guide sa atin on the concept of contracts. Before we get to define it doon sa mga susunod na slides, siguro it's important for us to understand na itong basic principles na to ay meron sa or existent sa lahat ng contracts. So, first is autonomy. So, autonomy is the freedom to stipulate, provided that they are not contrary to law, morals, and good customs, public order, and public policy. So, dito sa autonomy, sinasabi dito that both parties all the parties in the contract have the right to stipulate or may karapatan sila na maglagay ng terms and conditions na gusto nila sa contract. Okay? So, they are autonomous in that sense, na pwede silang maglagay ng kung anong gusto nilang maging terms and conditions ng kontrata. But there is a limitation under the law, the limitation is that provided they are not contrary to law, morals and good customs, public order, and public policy. So, okay lang daw na mag-stipulate ang mga parties or for the parties to agree on certain terms and conditions, except those which are contrary to law, morals and good customs, public order, or public policy. Now, there are certain types of contracts that are prohibited by law. For example, contracts with na ang object ay illicit, mga ganyan. Or they are contrary to morals or good customs, like contract concerning things that are considered immoral, or for example, contracts governing for now kasi illegal pa siya, contracts concerning yung flesh trade, mga ganyan. Good customs or public order or public policy, if it is contrary to all of these 5, to either of these 5 rather, it's not valid as a contract kasi hindi niya na fulfill yung concept ng autonomy. Okay? So next we have consensuality. In consensuality, contracts are perfected by mere consent. So just by agreeing with the terms and conditions at nagkasundo na kayo, the contract is already perfected by then. Okay? So, again, perfection is dependent on the consent itself only. So, kapag nagkasundo na kayo over the terms and conditions of something, yung nagkasundo na kayo sa object at consideration ng isang contract, it's already considered as a contract itself. There are exceptions, of course, like yung formal contracts natin, which require a certain form in order for it to be perfected. But otherwise, as a general rule, contracts are perfected by the mere consenting of the parties. And third one, we have mutuality. In mutuality, uh, it says here that the contract must bind both contracting parties. Its validity cannot be left to the will of one of them. Kumbaga, whether a valid is contract or not should depend on both the parties. Yung hindi pwedeng maging valid siya because one liked it and one doesn't, ano? Uh, hindi siya mutual kung ganun kapag yung isa lang yung may right to determine kung valid ba yung contract ay kung yung to determine the validity of the contract. So the both parties must consent. Both parties must give their consent, otherwise it's not mutual. Another basic principle of on contracts is obligatoriness. By obligatoriness, we mean that contracts have the force of law between the contracting parties. Kumbaga, here, uh, the two parties have have agreed on certain terms and conditions. Therefore, yung terms and conditions na yon is what governs the parties in that relationship that they created through the contract. So, whatever if there are doubts, I mean, if the parties are not sure on what their obligations are under the contract, well, they just have to look into the if there is a written document that evidences the contract, they can look into it. Ano na doon yung mga obligations nila sa isa't isa. So again, yung contracts is the law between the two parties, and because of that, they must observe these contracts and the stipulations in therein with they must perform their obligations rather in the contract in good faith. So performance in good faith is part of yung obligatoriness nitong contracts. So again, the contracts have the force of law between the contracting parties. And finally, we have relativity. In relativity, it says here that contracts take effect only between the parties, their assigns and heirs, except where the obligations arising from contract are not transmissible by their nature, by stipulation, or by provision of law. So here, uh, the contract only binds the parties, dahil nga sila lang yung nandoon sa kontrata. So anyone who is not privy to that contract may not be affected by that same contract, except when, for example, due to some causes, the person is not able to carry out his or her obligations in the contract. Nandoon yung kanyang assigns and heirs. Pero well, may mga limitations yan later on. Except where the obligations arising from contract are not transmissible by their nature, by stipulation, or by provision of law. So sinasabi dyan na although minsan may mga times na pwedeng maisali yung mga successors in interest nila or yung mga anak nila or yung mga tagapagmana nila, there are obligations that are not transmissible by their nature, by stipulation, or by provision of law. Ibig sabihin nun, it's only between the contracting parties. Okay? So as a rule, the contracts take effect only between the parties. And sometimes there are assigns and heirs. Kaya nga may exception diyan na there are some contracts which are really not may not be transmissible because of their nature, by stipulation, or by provision of law. So again, if you're not a party to the contract, you have there can be no obligation that will arise from that. Okay? So, yun yung basic principles natin ng contracts. So, in defining contracts, we need to look at yung essential requisites nito. what are these essential requisites? Ito yung tatlong mga dapat nating tignan in order to consider a contract, in order to consider whether something is a contract or not. Ang ano niyan, parang ta, ang ang acronym niya is COC. Of course, during the time when we're in law school, madali lang yan because Clash of Clans yung ano namin, yung mnemonic namin dyan. But COC, or Clerk of Court, pwede rin. COC. So, COC stands for Consent, Object, and Cause. So, in order for something to be considered as contract, it must comply with these three requisites. In the succeeding PowerPoints, we will discuss one by one kung ano ibig sabihin itong consent, object, and cause. So if something does not if a relation does not have yung consent or yung object or yung cause, hindi siya mako-consider as contract and therefore not covered by the law on contracts. So yeah. So first is consent. In consent, uh, meron tayong meeting of offer and acceptance upon the thing and the cause which are to constitute the contract. So, 'di ba matatandaan nyo COC yun ano? Uh, Consent, object, and cause or consideration. So, in consent, yung if the two parties agreed on the OC, yung object at yung object at yung consideration ng contract, that is already a consent. Meeting of the minds ang tinitignan natin. So, if both agreed to as to the object or and the consideration, that is already considered as consent, and it completes yung tatlong contracts na tinatawag na tatlong essential requisites ng contracts. So for example, if I say na uh, I offered you my phone, sabihin ko sa'yo, bili mo tong phone ko 2,000. If you said okay, sige, bilhin ko na, there is already a meeting of the mind. So we agree on something, we agreed on something. So there's already a meeting of the mind. Pero meron na bang doon, meron na bang object, yung cellphone, right? And yung consideration, yung 2,000. So there is already a meeting of the mind and there is consent. So there is a contract. That is perfect. Okay? So consent must be absolute and unqualified. Yung consent na ibibigay mo, kailangan absolute. Hindi pwedeng yes pero kasi ganyan-ganyan. Absolute dapat yes or no. Diba? Yung consent must be yes pala rather. Kasi yes lang yun. Kapag no, there's no consent. You did not consent to the contract, therefore there's no contract. So, it must also be unqualified. Hindi pwedeng sabihin mo na, okay, bili mo na tong phone ko 2,000. Mahal naman. Hindi ba pwedeng 1,500? Is that consent? No. Since that is a qualified consent, kung sabi mo, kung 1,500, bibilin ko yan. Is that consent? Not yet. So, walang meeting of minds kasi siya ang gusto niya 2,000. Ang gusto mo 1,500. So, there's no meeting of the mind there. So, ano yung tawag natin doon sa 1,500? That is what is called a counter offer. So for example, binigay ko sa yung phone, binibenta ko sa yung phone ng 2,000, sabi mo 1,500, no meeting of the minds yet, Kapag sinabi mo 1,500 at sabi ko, sige na nga, 1,500 na lang. Bili mo na. There is already a meeting of the mind there, but the meeting of the mind is at the consideration na 1,500, not the 2,000 na original price. Kailangan merong meeting of the minds before it can be considered as valid consent. So, also, in consent, we must take note of yung legal capacity ng parties. As a rule, sa under our civil code, uh, yung a person has the legal capacity to act or to legal capacity to enter into a contract kapag 18 years old siya. So, as a general rule, uh, pwede lang mag-enter into a contract ang isang tao if he or she is 18 and above. So, well, may mga exceptions. Of course, there are exceptions na kahit na hindi siya 18 ay pwede pa rin maging valid yung contract. But those are limited to what are called necessaries. Unfortunately, we will not touch them in this subject. But, yun. So, legal capacity of parties. So, a person who is incapable or below 18 or a minor, gana sinasabi natin, is incapacitated to enter into a contract. So, a person who is below 18 cannot give consent validly. Ano? So, since hindi siya valid, hindi siya pwede makapagbigay ng valid consent, he is incapable. Tingnan niyo dyan sa note nakalagay, incapability. Incapacity rather. And so, incapacity, since incapacitated siya, we will learn later on that yung contract is not really void. Hindi siya void, but it's voidable. Ano? So, that is incapacity. Pero meron din tayong mga tinatawag na prohibitions. Ano? There are prohibitions sa batas na kahit na legally kahit na sabihin natin na 18 years old and above sila, may mga provisions sa batas that prohibits them from entering into certain types of contracts. For example, a husband and wife cannot cannot donate to each other. Ano? So we need to think we need to keep that in mind. Kahit sabihin natin na they are above 18 pero may mga certain prohibitions under the law na kailangan nating i-take note. Okay? And finally, the consent must be intelligent, free, spontaneous, and real. So, it must be intelligent, free, spontaneous, and real. So, kailangan napag-isipan yung consent. It must be intelligent, must be free. Hindi ibig sabihin hindi ka pinikot to enter into a contract. For example, tinutukan ka ng barel, mga ganyan. Those are not allowed. And it must be spontaneous. And it must be real, of course. Kailangan real yung consent, hindi siya simulated. Kumbaga, pinapalabas na ganito pero actually iba pala yung intention, So, that is on consent. So, yan. For consent to be considered intelligent, free, spontaneous, and real, it must not have the following vices or vices of consent. So, bago daw natin makonsider na ang consent ay intelligent, free, spontaneous, and real, it must not have the following vices of consent. Ito yung vices of consent na to. Ito yung mga klase ng defect doon sa consent ng isang tao. First, a person cannot validly give consent if he is under duress. Kumbaga, a person, hindi matatawag na free yung consent ng tao if he is under duress. So, ano tong tinatawag natin na duress? Sa duress, there is violence or intimidation. So, a person is being intimidated or threatened kaya siya pumasok into a contract. For example, ako, I have no intention na bumili, for example, ng isang singsing. Pero dahil I was held at gunpoint, tinutukan ako ng baril, sabi niya, bili mo yan. Pumirma ka dyan sa deed of sale nung singsing and give me the money. Am I under duress? Yes. Is my consent vitiated? Yes. So, if you're under the threat of violence or intimidation, that is duress and that is a vice of consent. So, parang hindi intelligent, free, spontaneous, and real yung consent mo, and therefore, there's no real consent there. There is no there in it's as if the consent is not valid, ano. So undue influence, ito naman sa undue influence, improper advantage of power ang tinatawag natin dito. Kumbaga, napilitan tayo because they are elderly, they are of a certain position of power in relation to us, ano. Kumbaga, sinusulan tayo to do something, which is actually we only entered into the contract because sinusulan tayo ng isang taong powerful kaysa sa atin. So that is undue influence. Mistake or error, dito naman ito naman, inadvertent, unexcusable disregard of circumstances material to a contract. It is inadvertent, hindi sinasadya. At excusable naman siya. Na disregard of a circumstance material to a contract. For example, hindi lang you were not expecting that something, you bought a frame, a frame with a stand, ano? Nagkamali ka lang na ang mali yung specifications na nabigay na nabigay sa iyo. So that is a mistake, ano. It's an inadvertent or ano siya, although that for example yung frame ay iba pala dun sa sa hindi pala suited para dun sa need mo, mga ganyan, and it was a product of mistake, that can be considered as mistake or error and can be considered as a vice of consent if hindi talaga nagkamali ka on your side. And finally, yung tinatawag natin na fraud, or for example, one party niloko na yung isang party. Or in fraud, there is insidious words or machinations on the part of one of the parties whereby the other is induced to execute without which he would not have agreed. Okay? So, yung isang party, niloko niya yung isang party para ulit, para, for example, para mag-enter into a contract in where, because of yung fraud, kung hindi dahil sa fraud, hindi niya talaga bibilihin yung isang bagay. Ito yung tinatawag natin na, as if you may recall, yung sa distinction natin ng dolo incidente at dolo causante, ito yung tinatawag natin na dolo causante. So here, walang intention for example, walang intention si buyer na bumili talaga ng thing na binentahan ng bili ka ng lupa 1,000 square meters, sabi. Mura lang, ganito. Pero later on, malalaman mo pala na either hindi sa kanya yung lupa, mga ganyan, or hindi pala 1,000 square meters yun, kundi 100 lang. So that is an example of dolo causante. So yun, kumbaga there is panloloko in the first place na kung hindi dahil sa panloloko na yun, hindi talaga papasok sa kontrata yung tao. So that is another vice of consent. So yan. So punta naman tayo sa second requisite of contracts. So kanina yung consent, consent is more of yung consent is more of psychological, kasi there is the meeting, because there's the meeting of the minds, mga ganyan, and any vice of consent invalidates the consent itself and therefore the contract. Here sa object, when we talk of object, di ba kung naalala niyo yung sa obligations, yung object doon ay to give, to do, or not to do. Similar yun dito sa contracts. Sa contracts, it could be a thing, it could be rights or services. Diba? Yung things, rights, services, pwede yung mag-fall under to give or to do. Which is the subject matter of the contract. So, yung kung ano yung subject matter ng contract, yun yung tinatawag natin na object. Okay, what do we need to think? What do we need to consider when dealing with object? Ano? So the object must be certain or ascertainable, determinate or indeterminate. Okay. Uh, Kailangan uh, malinaw kung ano yung object ng contract na pinapasukan nyo. Okay? Because if not, well, pala nun, that might not be a valid object to begin with. Ano? For example, bili ka ng bili ka na ng lupa. Pero I don't know what kung anong lupa 'yon, kung saan, kung gaano kalaki, walang specifics, hindi mo ma-certain. Well, in that case, aling lupa yung binibenta niya, 'di ba? So, you must be certain kung ano yung object ng contract. Okay, it must be certain or at least ascertainable. Yung pwede mong you can separate it from other things. Okay? So it must be within the commerce of men, or it must be transmissible. So hindi mo pwede, for example, ipagbenta ang space because that's not really outer space. And you can't sell outer space because you don't own it to begin with, and it's not really for sale. It's not within the commerce of men, no? So it's not transmissible. Kaya hindi mo siya pwedeng ipagbenta. Or yung dagat, hindi mo pwedeng ipabenta yung dagat kasi that is outside the commerce of men, because that is something that is res communis, or it is something that is owned by everyone. So it's outside the commerce of men. Ito yung tinatawag natin na ito yung mga bagay na hindi natin pwede ibenta dahil hindi naman sa atin to begin with, no? Hindi mo siya pwedeng i-transfer because it's not yours. In the case of yung dagat, it's the ownership of everyone. It's the ownership of every human being. It must be actual or possible experience. Of course, you can buy something that is a product of your imagination. No, it must be actual. Or it must be It must be capable of existing. Okay. For example, alam namang sabihin mo na bibentang ka ng angel, or bibentang ka ng unicorn. Those are not actual things. Those are imagined things. So unless they are figurines, those cannot be valid objects of the contract. And finally, it must be lawful. It must not be contrary to LMGPP. Yung nakita na natin kanina, yung LMGPP, law, morals, good customs, public order, and public policy. So, an illicit thing or isang bagay na illegal cannot be the object of a contract. Nasabi na natin yan kanina, nabanggit na natin siya. So, hindi pwedeng maging subject ng valid contract ang drugs, mga ganyan, because it's against the law. Hindi pwedeng ipagbenta, for example, ang isang tao, because that is against the law, and of course this also against morals and good customs. So those are yung valid objects of contracts. Ano yung mga hindi valid objects of contracts? First, future inheritance. Hindi mo pwedeng ipagbenta yung isang bagay na ipapamana pa lang sa'yo. Okay? Dapat kasi yung karapatan mo doon, bibenta mo na yung lupa ng tatay mo, mamamana ko rin naman yan ngayon. Mamamana ko rin naman yan later. So that's not valid. Hindi siya valid na object ng contract because your right over your future inheritance is still in Kuwait. Kumbaga, hindi sa Kuwait, in Kuwait. What do you mean by in Kuwait? It is still imaginary. Hindi mo pa siya actually ownership. So you cannot transfer it. Hindi mo pa siya pwedeng maging subject ng contract. Okay. Again, not valid are yung impossible things or services. Gaya nga nang nasabi natin kanina, yung mga bagay na hindi naman possible na mangyari, or mga services na hindi naman possibly pwedeng i-provide. Those are not valid objects of contracts. For example, although I consider this impossible, pero siguro things at times may change later. For example, I will give you 1 million pesos, pero you will have to remove yung tubig sa buong Pacific Ocean. Of course, it's impossible service, right? So really, there's no object there. I mean, the object there is not valid because that is something that is a service that is impossible. Okay? And the right to receive support. Hindi mo pwedeng gawing object ng contract yung karapatan mo na makareceive ng support. Why? Kasi it's like selling your life or your source of life, ano? Para mong binibenta na rin yung ikabubuhay mo. So it's not a valid object of contract by express provision of law. Hindi mo pwedeng uh, i-waive yung right to receive support mo uh, for a fee, mga ganyan, or whatever. Basta hindi siya pwedeng maging subject ng contract. Okay, so the third requisite of contracts is cost or consideration. Depends kung ano yung tawag nyo dyan. I mean, these are interchangeable anyway, so it could be cost or consideration. So, cost or consideration is the essential or more proximate purpose which the contracting parties have in view at the time of entering into the contract. So, why are they entering into that contract to begin with? Ano ang kapalit nung kumbaga, ano yung kapalit ng object na ibibigay nila? So what is the consideration kumbaga, what is the consideration that they are thinking about when they entered into the contract? So yun yung tinatawag na cost or consideration. Here, the requisites of cost or consideration are it must be present or existent, it must be true or real, and it must be lawful. Parang sa object lang din. So, it must be present or existent, it must be true or real, and it must be lawful. Okay, here, in bilateral obligations, the cost for one is the object for the other. So, kung if both parties are debtors and creditors of each other, for example, yung cost or consideration depends really on whose point of view you're looking at. Pero pwedeng maging pareho yung pwedeng yung isang bagay or yung isang service could be the consideration, and at the same time the object. Depende sa kung kaninong point of view yon. If it's from the point of view of the creditor, or maybe yung isa ay yung object, yung isa ay yung consideration. Pero from the point of view of the debtor, pwedeng yung the object is from dun sa object ni creditor could be the consideration for the debtor. So, in bilateral obligations, it's really interchangeable. Kaya kung mapapansin nyo, yung almost the same yung, it's the same rather, yung requisites ni consideration or ni cost sa object. They must both be present and existent, they must be true or real, they must be lawful, because pwede sila maging interchangeable. Okay? And it could be onerous, remuneratory, or gratuitous. It is onerous kapag it is a thing for another. Kumbaga, I give you something, you return something of value sa akin din. For example, I give you my cell phone, you give me a phone. Mga ganyan. Remuneratory, ito naman for parang remuneration for past services. Kumbaga, payment for past services. So, kung ano na yung, for example, nagtrabaho siya for you for a month, ganyan, sasahuran mo siya ng a certain amount of compensation, yun yung consideration doon. It could be remuneratory. Kumbaga, parang you give something in exchange for you give something in exchange for the service that was rendered to you. It can also be gratuitous. By gratuitous, we mean it is uh, it is given out of yung goodwill ng tao. It is somehow a donation, ano? Walang, in essence, wala siyang kapalit. Kumbaga, yung you give something dahil gusto mo, and siguro ang pwede na lang na maging ano doon, maging consideration doon is yung good feeling that you feel after you donate something or after you give something. So, yun yung cost or consideration. Again, we go back. So, in a contract, we look at yung consent, object, and consideration. If these three exist, then that is considered as a contract. Okay? So, yun yung COC na tinatawag natin. We should always bear that in mind. Okay? So, let's give an example siguro to illustrate that point. Uh, I will buy your horse. Sige, ako na rin. Let's, mas maigi siguro uh, if this is a conversation. Ano? Kunwari ako, pare, biling ko na yung kabayo mo, 14,000. Okay? Yung pare ko, sabi niya, yes, sige, bilhin mo na. Yung pagsabi niya ng yes is already an indication of consent. So, nag-consent na siya doon. The object is the horse, and the consideration is yung 14,000 na ibabayad ko sa kanya. So, in that case, that is already a contract. It's as simple as that. Ganun lang tignan yung kontrata.